Buen día, buenos días.
So, good morning. Sharp on time, we're going to start with the first speech of this international seminar. For us, it is an honor and a pleasure to have here among us Dr. Claire Duncanson. She comes from the University of Edinburgh. Claire is a professor of international relations in this university. Her research is focusing on the intersection between national safety, theory of IR, and gender policies. She has published widely about topics linked on military masculinity, women in the armed forces, gender, and peace consolidation. Before establishing herself in the academia sector, she was working for several NGOs of international development and human rights. Among them, International Amnesty, Jubilee 2000, and Global Perspective. Dr. Duncanson will talk today about hegemonic masculinity and the possibility of change in gender relations. Thank you, Claire, for being here.
Gracias. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here. And I very much appreciate the welcoming words about how fantastic this workshop is going to be. So the term hegemonic masculinity is well established in gender and sexuality studies. Since its introduction in the 1980s by Raewyn Connell and colleagues, many theorists have built on the insights that masculinities are multiple, that they exist in relations of hierarchy, dominated by a loosely coherent and evolving hegemonic form, which dominates not through overt oppression, so much as by consent. And this concept's been used in a variety of contexts. And it's been used to explain the persistence of male dominance in this context of multiple dynamic masculinities. And this was one of the reasons, I think, that Connell introduced it. The need for a concept that could explain both the persistence of male power and the potential for social change. So I think that Connell, in her earlier work and today, maintains that the concept does allow for progressive change, for more equal gender relations. But I think that in its application, when people have used hegemonic masculinity in empirical contexts, often what's been emphasized is the persistence of male dominance, not the possibility for change. And I think that's particularly the case in my field, which is feminist international relations. So today what I want to do is to challenge some of that pessimism that I see in feminist IR, and in particular to build on what I think has been a bit of a neglected strand in Connell's work, which is about how change might be theorized. So I will firstly just give an overview of how hegemonic masculinity has been used in feminist scholarship, focusing on military masculinities. The next section is maybe more theoretical, looking in detail at some of Connell's work, thinking about how she proposed hegemonic masculinity might be challenged, and I'll suggest my alternative take on that. And then I'll conclude just with some suggestions about practical ways forward, how you would encourage more equitable gender relations. So, the concept of hegemonic masculinity has been useful to many feminists because it's helped explain the multiplicity of masculinities you can see in militaries and in particular the army. So although you can see there's different masculinities, the masculinity of the officer class and the masculinity of the infantry squaddie in UK parlance. The masculinity of the engineer, the masculinity of the fighting soldier, the masculinity of the general sitting at home in the rear. The way that the stiff upper lip, the concealment of emotion, and displays of grief can both be seen as masculine. So hegemonic masculinity has helped us theorize the way that there might be these different masculinities and contradictory masculinities, and yet there still remains this association between masculinities and militaries that seems hard to shift. And militaries and militarism, it's hard to shift the power of those in public life. So Cynthia Enlow's work is perhaps emblematic or exemplifies how hegemonic masculinity is often used in feminist IR scholarship. So here she points to the way that certain ideas and ideals about being a soldier have dominated in army cultures. So these ideas have differed slightly in different times and places, but have generally been associated with combat. So ideas about toughness, endurance, bravery, aggression, action, competitiveness, the ability to defeat the enemy. So the argument is not that all soldiers fit that model. It's not even that the majority fit that model, but it's the way that a loosely evolving form associated with combat has been the cultural ideal, the way to prove yourself a real man. And that this has effects beyond the military. It's influenced how men more broadly negotiate their masculinity. They have to negotiate their masculinity in relation to this cultural ideal. And feminists have argued that this hegemonic masculinity has been constructed through the feminization of the other. And this one example would be through military training, where the threat of being feminized, the threat of not being man enough, is used to motivate soldiers to prove themselves a real man. The threat of being feminized is used to downgrade and police other groups with terms such as, you know, don't be such a girl, don't be such a woman, don't be such a pussy, don't be such a fag. So these strategies of feminization, although directed at men, the argument goes, have an impact on women by reinforcing the idea of the feminized as inferior. And feminists have argued that the dominance of this loosely coherent combat model of hegemonic masculinity has had important material effects. And one might be the discrimination and violence against women seen within militaries, both men perpetrating violence against their female colleagues and rape used in war zones, sexual abuse by soldiers on peacekeeping missions. A second would be the way that the hegemony of this model means that foreign policies associated with aggression, with combat, with being tough and assertive, not backing down, are the foreign policies that are privileged. And thirdly, another impact of the way that hegemonic masculinity is constructed through the subordination of the other is it reinforces the idea that gender is a hierarchical, dichotomous structure. However, militaries have changed in recent years, last decade or so. They've shifted focus from traditional warfare to being involved in a bigger variety of operations, including peace building, so-called stabilization operations. Western militaries have downsized, modernized, increased in their professionalism, and that's had implications for gender relations. And of course, militaries don't exist in isolation from wider society, and military masculinities have thus been influenced by changes in masculinities in civilian culture. So the things that Mark was talking about last night, the metrosexual and spornosexual, the declining homophobia that he mentioned, all those have influenced military masculinities as well. So what have feminists had to say about this? What do they say now about military masculinities in this changed context? Do we see new military masculinities becoming hegemonic, becoming the ideal way of being a man? And given that part of what militaries have been doing is around peace support operations, are these new hegemonic masculinities less combative, less aggressive? And if so, might we see less sexual violence? Might we see less violent foreign policies? Well, feminist scholars have traced what they see as new emerging masculinities in the context of these peace support operations. And they tend to conclude that the new hegemonic masculinity is tough and tender, in the words of Steve Neva, or the humanitarian soldier scholar, as Lali Khalili would put it. So the idea that the ideal military masculinity has to be tough enough to defeat insurgents, but also compassionate, also able to protect civilians, escort children to school, deliver humanitarian aid, negotiate ceasefires between belligerent parties, so using brain as much as brawn, to win hearts and minds, as the common phrase in Afghanistan and Iraq have it. But crucially, for most feminists, this does not represent progress. Most of the feminist scholarship that looks at these new tough and tender masculinities argues that the way that they are constructed is through the demonization of men in the lands in which they are intervening. So Iraqi men, Afghan men, Somalian men are constructed as backward, as primitive, barbaric, hyper-masculine, excessively violent. So people talk of the dangerous brown man. So this is how the new masculinities are created, as civilized, advanced, compassionate, the bearers of human rights and democracy. It's through the demonization of the other. So new hierarchies, race and class hierarchies are being created. So feminists ask, if that's the case, how can this be progress? the discourse of the new peacekeeping masculinity, tough and tender, distracts from the role, the causes of the conflicts. It distracts from the role of the Cold War, of the arms trade, of neoliberal economic policies in causing conflict. And because soldiers seem to have adopted practices that were once feminine, or that feminists wanted them to adopt, less violent, more compassionate, all that we're seeing here is the co-option of feminism into new forms of domination, racism, and neo-imperialism. So I'm generalizing, but in the main, feminist IR scholars have very little positive to say about the shifts that some identify in military masculinities. Excuse me. And my contention is that, in part, that's because, as Begonia said, we do live in a troubling context, where we do see militarism and neo-imperialism as dominant forces. But I think it's also in part to do with the concept of hegemonic masculinity and how it's been applied. So the formulation of hegemonic masculinity lends itself to those applications. So if we look at some definitions, because Connell sometimes uses phrases such as hegemonic masculinity is the configuration of gender practice which embodies the currently accepted answer to the problem of legitimacy of patriarchy. Or as Charlotte Hooper once put it, hegemonic masculinity gets transformed through constant challenges and struggles to resemble whatever traits happen to be most strategically useful for the getting and keeping of power. So if we think of hegemonic masculinity as something that is always the form of masculinity which allows it to retain power, it comes close to collapsing into power. The risk is that we come to our analyses of gender relations with a framework within which progressive change just can't be conceptualized. However, I think the main thrust of Connell's work doesn't have that pessimism. So here's another quote, which I think indicates that she thinks that hegemonic masculinity is capable of radical reform, of being challenged, of being unraveled, and more equitable gender relations resulting. So two questions arise, bearing in mind what I've just said about the tough and tender masculinities. One question would be, is Connell attentive enough to intersectionality, to the way that, in practice, challenges to hegemonic masculinity or new models of hegemonic masculinity seem to involve the demonization and subordination of the other along axes of race and class? And secondly, how is this dismantling supposed to come about? So taking the latter question first, the most explicit articulation, I think, of this commitment to the possibility of dismantling hegemonic masculinity appears in this 2005 article, where Connell and Messerschmidt argue that gender relations are always areas of tension, of contestation, and that, crucially, hegemony may fail. So they are quite clear that the concept of hegemonic masculinity should not imply that masculinity's dominance over femininity and men's dominance over women is inevitable. Gender relations can be made more equal. As for the how, the suggestion here is that there can be a positive hegemonic masculinity. Positive in the sense that it is open to equality with women, but hegemonic in the sense that it remains hegemonic among men. So it seems to me that what Connell and Messerschmidt are proposing is a two-stage model. So there's a transitional stage where a version of masculinity is established which is open to equality with women. And then the second stage would be eradicating those relations of hierarchy. But I think this formulation is problematic. If we recall the means by which hegemonic masculinity achieves its hegemonic status, that is through the feminization of other groups of men and the feminization and subordination of women, then it's hard to see how a masculinity open to equality could ever be hegemonic. In order to have become hegemonic, it must necessarily have subordinated others. So I would suggest that if there are to be two stages, the transitional stage would be more likely to be the one where hegemonic masculinity shifts to adopt the traits and the values and the practices that are conventionally associated with femininity. So rather than the relational aspect coming first, the disposition towards empathy, equality, recognizing similarity with others, which seems to me the kind of crucial, maybe more difficult challenge, the more achievable and more likely first step is the adoption of those practices traditionally thought of as feminine. And this is, of course, the thing that feminists were pointing to when they talked of tough and tender peacekeeping soldiers. And as I've said, the thing that feminists find to be so problematic. I think that sometimes we're too quick to dismiss these hybrid, contradictory models of hegemonic masculinity. That although sometimes they are deeply problematic and exist to distract us from ongoing oppressions, in another sense they can be seen perhaps as the necessary transition stage to more progressive gender relations. So just going back to these examples of soldiers involved in non-traditional military practices, maybe that have traditionally been thought of as feminine, care and compassion and mediation. This makes their masculinity even more contradictory than ever, this tough and tender. But it seems to me the important question that we should really focus on is how are these masculinities constructed? To pay close attention to whether they're always constructed through the demonization of other men, through the demonization of Iraqi, Afghan, Somalian, and so on men. Post-structuralist theorists from Foucault and Deleuze to William Connolly and Lena Hansen have argued that yes, identities are always relational, but they don't have to be oppositional and hierarchical. So Lena Hansen has talked of radical others and non-radical others. So self-identities can be constructed through relations of empathy, equality, mutual respect, recognition of similarity. So as well as looking to see what kinds of practices soldiers or men in any context are being constructed as manly, we need to pay more attention to how those constructions are enacted. Are they carried out in ways that break down hierarchies and build relations of equality, empathy, and mutual respect? Or are they carried out in ways that just reconstitute new hierarchies? The civilized white peacekeeper and the barbaric man. Okay. And I would contend that we do see some evidence, not much, but some evidence of soldiers working in Iraq and Afghanistan, building relationships of empathy, respect with the Iraqis and Afghan men that they worked with. Few and far between, but I think they are there. So my argument is not a defense of militaries and what they have done in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I think those glimmers of relationship building are interesting theoretically for thinking through how progressive change might come about. So in sum, I agree with Connell that positive change is possible, that hegemony may fail, but I disagree over the way in which it can happen. So the idea of a masculinity hegemonic among men, retaining its hegemony, but being open to relations of equality, seems to me to be contradictory and inconsistent. But the idea that a softer, more feminized form of hybrid masculinity, in the sense that it has incorporated traits and practices associated with women and femininity, in the way that Mark was talking about last night with the metrosexual, the idea that that hybrid could become hegemonic seems theoretically possible and empirically observable in a whole range of contexts. And this phenomenon of the hybrid, contradictory, hegemonic masculinity has the potential to be dangerous, for sure. It can be constructed through making new oppressive hierarchies, or it can be more positive. It's more positive in those cases, and only in those cases, where it's constructed through relations of empathy, equality, respect. So how do we achieve this more elusive element of a challenge to hegemonic masculinity? How do we achieve more equal gender relations? Just two suggestions. And one is to go on highlighting the hybrids, their contradictory nature. So like the work Mark was doing last night, this really interesting ways that masculinities are shifting to embody things that once were thought of as femininity. Highlighting the contradictions is a useful strategy, thinking again in the military context. So Western militaries that claim to be forces for good. There's only so long that they can claim to be a force for good whilst thinking of themselves as superior to the masculinities in the lands in which they intervene. So keep highlighting the contradictions. And then secondly, perhaps there's a focus amongst feminists on getting men to change their ways. Men need to do more of this, that, and the next thing. But maybe we need to focus more on changing relationships, i.e., the way that men construct their identity through relationships. So it's that focus on the relational aspect. Are we seeing identities being constructed through empathy, respect, and care and compassion? That to me seems crucial. So I'll leave you with those thoughts.